We are continuing on. We've got 2 weeks left in our sermon in the series in the book of Acts. So we're going to be in Acts chapter 27 today. So if you would, please grab your Bibles once you're done with that connection card and turn to Acts chapter 27. If you're with us today and you don't happen to have a Bible, you can feel free to grab one from the seat in front of you. It'll look just like mine here. It'll be the exact same one. And we're going to be on page 1122. So feel free to turn there if you like. Before we get into our message for today, I just wanted to share a personal story from the Pounds household this week. As many of you guys know, we've got 5 kids under 5 in our house, and that makes things interesting. But our oldest is Hazel, and she's a few months away from being 5 years old. And Hazel was working with her mom because Annabelle is really good about trying to get the kids to memorize Scripture, even at this young age. The oldest 3 have memorized Genesis 1:1, and now they're working on Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. And the verse is, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." So the word "fool" is used in there. And Hazel asked her mom, she's been working for a week or more to memorize this, and she says, "Mom, what's a fool?" And so Annabelle's thinking, how do you contextualize the word fool to a 4-year-old? And she says, well, it's somebody who disobeys their parents and who doesn't listen to people when they try to help them and who gets in trouble a lot. And Hazel paused for a second and said, "My brothers." I guess there are moments. So it's interesting. So if she starts referencing them that way, you guys know where that all came from. It's always interesting with kids. They make connections you wouldn't think to. But so as a reminder today, we are in the book of Acts, and we, as I said, we're just finishing out this series, which is exciting. And as we've watched, we've seen towards the end of this book that the Apostle Paul has been put on trial. He's been put on trial for a crime he didn't commit. He was accused of trying to usurp the Roman government, of desecrating the temple, of speaking out against the law of Moses. And only one of those things is actually a crime from the Roman government's perspective. But even that, the people that falsely accusing him didn't have any evidence to support it. And so, in spite of that, local government officials under pressure from Jewish leadership kept Paul in prison for more than 2 years, or well over 2 years. And finally, it seemed like one of those leaders was preparing to send Paul to stand trial before his accusers, with them being the judge, jury, and executioner. And understandably, Paul didn't think this was a very good idea. You can imagine if our legal system worked that way and the person who accused you was the one who got to decide whether you were guilty or not. That doesn't seem like the fairest system ever. And so Paul, as a Roman citizen, and about 1 in 15 people at this point in time are Roman citizens, used his special privilege that he had of being able to appeal his case to Caesar himself. And so now he needs to travel from Caesarea in the province of Judea, where Jerusalem is, and he's going to have to travel across the Mediterranean Sea. And I've even got a map up here to help us. We're going to actually leave this up throughout the sermon today so that you guys can see as we're talking about all this. But Paul, he needs to go from Caesarea on the far right here, and he's going to travel clear up to the capital city of the Roman Empire, also known as Rome. And in the ancient world, the most convenient and timely way typically to do this would be through sea travel. Would be to find a ship that you could pay for passage on and get from A to B. Now, while Paul does this, he's still a prisoner. He's still viewed as a prisoner because he hasn't been found guilty or innocent of the crime. Even though we can see broadly that even the people who put him on trial were only hanging on to him because they were hoping he'd pay him off, or because they didn't want to get in trouble with some of the people they were governing. They were caving to peer pressure effectively to keep Paul there. And so we're going to talk about his journey and the different challenges that Paul has as he makes this trip. And I think there's a big, deeper point that God's going to try to convey to us through this. So I hope your hearts will be open to that as we talk about this story. And I pray that God will use that. I'm going to set this here, and I hope I remember that I said it here. I think that God's really going to speak to us through that and tell us a deeper truth that we can really apply to our lives. So we will be in Acts chapter 27, and we're going to begin by reading verses 1 through 8. Before we start reading today, though, would you join me just for a moment of prayer? Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to gather together and for this chance to study your word. Lord, I pray that you would speak to our hearts and that you would open them to the truth you have to share with us. for each one of us, wherever life finds us. If we're here and we're breathing, you're not done with us. You want to draw us closer to you, and I pray that we would accept that, and that as you share your word with us today, that we would understand it and be drawn to you. We ask this in Jesus Christ's name and merit, Lord. Amen. Okay, Acts chapter 27, as I said, beginning with verses 1 through 8. As we typically do here, we're going to break our passage down into 5 or so pieces. We're going to read each section, and then we'll stop and we'll discuss it. And I hope that God will use that to bring it to life for you. There's a lot of context that will help with our story today. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium and about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there, we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed in Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. And we made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salome. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. Okay, so Paul is about to start off this journey. He now has to travel. And this is what actually happens is sort of the common travel mechanism of the day. It's sort of fascinating here. Now, the Roman government did actually have a navy that they had available to them. And one might think if a government's going to transfer a prisoner, that they ought to just go ahead and throw that prisoner on one of their battleships and drive him across the ocean and put him there. And of course, they didn't have conventional battleships, and it was very rudimentary warships. But the cheapest and most effective way the Roman government found to do this was to take prisoners and, with a group of guards to watch over them, put them all on a private ship that they would pay passage for on, and then sail them to where they're going. Now, a few things I want to note here before we talk about the beginnings of the actual voyage is that at the beginning of our chapter, we hear that there are actually 3 people that are traveling with Paul. And one of them is a familiar name that we have heard before, someone who Paul picked up during his 3rd missionary journey. And the other is included in just the article that's being used. And so we have Trophimus, and then we have the word "we" used, which is indicating that it's actually Luke who's with him. Now, it's thought that Luke is actually along with Paul throughout the couple of years that he's in prison and is regularly checking on him. This is especially necessary because in the ancient world, if you went to jail, there was actually no legal requirement that they feed you. And so if you wanted to be fed while you spent, in Paul's case, well over 2 years in prison, it'd be really helpful to have made some friends outside who were willing to come and bring you resources on a regular basis and make sure that your basic needs were met. Now, Luke was probably part of that, and Luke and Paul's other companion go and board the ship. They get on together, and in their cases, they would have to pay for a ticket, whereas Paul, since he's a prisoner, he gets to travel for free and in chains, but it's a special package that they have, and so he boards this ship, and he begins the journey. Now, typically, at this point in time of the year, the winds would be coming strongly from the west. And if the wind is coming from the west and moving towards the east, you can imagine that's kind of the opposite of what really they would want to see as they're making this voyage. And typically for sailing vessels, the way they would compensate for this is that they would sail right along the coast. And you could make very slow headway on this trip, which would have taken at least a month in ideal circumstances, at least a month. But you'll make even slower progress during this time. We're heading into the stormy time of year when nobody should be traveling. There's about a 3-month period starting mid-November where most Romans would have considered it suicidal to be out traveling on the Mediterranean. And so, since as you might gather, we're dealing with sailing vessels. There's no motors. They have really primitive oars, but that's not a great way to overcome the wind, especially in a large vessel. What they do is they'll sail along the coast, and even though you need to go this way and the wind is blowing from this way, you can actually wait. And typically, the sailors would wait off the coast at night, and as the air cooled coming off the mountains along the coastline, the air would fall down. The cold air would come down from the mountains and travel downward, and that would actually just provide enough airflow that you could nudge these sailboats forward and make progress along the coast. And so typically that's the way that a mariner at this era sailing into the wind would deal with it. And so we hear that the journey begins at Caesarea, that they stop over at Sidon, they continue and go north of Cyprus, stop at Myra. At Myra we hear that Paul is allowed an opportunity to go ahead and visit a local church or some local Christians so that he can get support from them. Again, what we're talking about here is that Paul doesn't get a meal by default as a prisoner, and so he needs to go to these other Christians and say, guys, I'm a prisoner here, and fortunately he's trusted by this centurion. They allow him to go, probably under guard, to travel there, and Paul goes and asks these Christian brothers and sisters, hey, I've been falsely accused and imprisoned, which would be common for a Christian of that era, and I'm headed to Rome. Can you guys give me some food or some money so I can have some food so that I'll be taken care of in this voyage? And fortunately, Paul is provided for and is able to make that. And they get up near Cnidus. And the desire that they have is actually to continue along the coastline using the winds to make their trip. But as this happens, the wind starts to change direction. And they get a nor'eastern beginning to come in, as we'll see here in a moment as well. And so, because of that, and because of the challenges with it, they sail south, they get down on the bottom side of Crete, and right now, they're stopped in Lesio or Fairhaven, in this little port on the Isle of Crete, and they're waiting there to see what they can do next. The big challenge, more than anything that they're facing, is just that they're sailing at a very inconvenient time of the year. Once they hit that port, though, we hear that Julius goes and finds another boat to put all these people on. It sounds like this is a much bigger boat, and it'll be carrying them. Let me mention as well, the most common sea travel of this era in the Roman world is actually grain being taken, it's upside down, that won't help, from Egypt and being taken up to Rome itself. Rome does not have optimal land for growing grain at. Egypt does. They're using flood irrigation from the Nile, and so they actually produce a really robust harvest. And so grain ships will be constantly traveling from Alexandria, typically the capital city of Egypt, and be making their way up and heading over to Italy from there. And that's the largest amount of freight carried in the Mediterranean in this area is that. And we'll see in a minute that this vessel appears to be hauling a lot of grain as well. And that seems to be one of their big concerns. Okay, so let's pick back up now, and we will read verses 9 through 12. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous, because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our lives also. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was suitable to winter in, since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. So, looking at the map here again, you can kind of see what they're trying to decide. They're here in Fairhaven, down on the side of this Isle of Crete, and Phoenix is only 5 miles away. It's a short distance. But, and their desire is maybe we can winter here in Phoenix. Phoenix is a much larger port, and you can imagine that from the sailor's perspective, that ideally they'd like to be where there's more people if they're going to spend 3 months being stuck somewhere. Also, just the conditions along the coast and the type of port available in Phoenix is better, and so it would be safer to winter there. But as they board the ship, Paul says to the leadership, guys, God's given me a really strong feeling that if we take this trip and we go, I know it's only 5 miles, but if we go and do this, we're going to be in grave danger. This is not going to go well for us. We may very well lose this ship and virtually everybody on board. It's a real risk here. But as they're thinking about it, we can imagine that the leaders of the ship are thinking about, we need to make more mileage here. We need to get further ahead. This isn't the safest place on Earth. Plus, most of us would like to be in a place where there might be bars present and companionship and whatever else ancient sailors wanted to find in a major port. Civilization being there, as they would probably find if they make it to Phoenix. And so their desire is strong, and they decide, in spite of what Paul says, because probably most of them are thinking, who's this Paul guy anyway, and why would we listen to him? They decide, we're not going to do that. We're just going to go forward. I think we can make it to where we're headed. If you guys notice where the line travels, you can see it doesn't work as well as they hope. So let's continue on here. Oh, and I'll mention, they mention in the course of the last section that we read, the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is actually a date that moves year to year, a little bit like Easter. It changes weekends, the Sundays that it's on, depending on what year it is. And typically, the Day of Atonement is actually going to be in late August or early September. And as I said before, it was unadvisable by mid-September to even be traveling on the Mediterranean, and the Romans would have considered it suicidal to be doing it by mid-November. So there's this time frame here, just depending on how the weather is. You're in the danger zone, so to speak, and this could go poorly. All right. So now, continuing on verses 13 through 26. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the Northeaster, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so they gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the men hoisted it aboard, and then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together, because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But I urge you to keep your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.'" Okay, so the weather conditions seem calm and nice. There's a slight southerly wind, and the sailors are beginning to think, hey, this could work out for us. That slight southerly wind coming from Crete, we can hit that with our sails and get pushed up to Phoenix. It's only a 5-mile journey. I'm sure it'll be fine. And so they begin that voyage, and in no time, a nor'easter wind, appropriately called because it's a hurricane-force wind coming from the northeast, hits them forcefully. And as you might guess, that's sort of the opposite direction from where they want to go. They want to get up to Phoenix, but they're unable to. There's a little island off the coast of Crete called Cauda, and they say basically they're blown off course. Immediately, as they start experiencing these winds, they start throwing cargo overboard to lighten the ship, because the deeper the ship is in the water, the more likely it is to be overtaken by the waves. And they're dropping anchors, they're throwing even the tackle from the ship overboard, the stuff used to repair the ship. All of that gets thrown over the side too. We just got to lose whatever weight we can, and very little of the cargo is actually kept on hand to try to keep it from being sunk. In fact, the panic is bad enough as they watch and they're blown along. It sounds as if the lifeboat is actually, in the course of these winds coming in, it's probably colliding with the ship and posing a danger to the lifeboat itself, which traditionally in the ancient world would have been towed behind the ship on a rope. And so as they see it kind of as a missile hitting the ship and causing damage and to it and the ship, they decide, let's pull that up, let's put it on the deck. And they even take an extreme step of taking ropes and looping them around the hull of the ship, because the wind force is so violent in the course of this hurricane that they can see the planks on the side of this ship that they're on bowing and creaking and starting to come out of place. They're thinking, if we don't get ropes on this thing, if we have the slightest issue, we might actually just come apart right here in the middle of the ocean and all drown. And as difficult as it would be to swim in the ocean under normal circumstances, you can imagine with hurricane force winds, it wouldn't be a lot more fun. So things are getting messier and messier for them. There is some fear that the sailors seem to have that they're going to run into sandbars. And there is a chain of quicksand-like sand that exists off the coast of North Africa. And in the ancient world, it was often referenced as a ship graveyard, because many ships would go there, get stuck in it, and you'd never move again. But you could be stuck miles off the coast, and once you're in that chain of sandbars, you're basically just waiting for your ship to break apart, and then I guess you see if you can swim 20 miles to the coast or not. Not a pretty situation, and under normal circumstances, that would be an extreme distance to be blown off course, but when you have hurricane winds, even without sails up, the size of that ship is big enough, its space above the water is big enough, that wind can really move it, and it can send you places you never dreamed with all of those forces at work. So Paul's prediction seems to be coming true. They're in much worse danger than they thought they were, and there's a solid chance here that they won't make it out of it. And I want to really draw your attention to what Paul begins saying, clear back in verse 21, but really emphasizing verse 23. Paul comes to the sailors in the midst of all of this when things look hopeless. They're literally throwing the cargo overboard, which is the only thing they get paid for, which means this whole trip now, no one's making any money off of it. In fact, the owner of the ship might now be bankrupt. But in spite of that, in spite of the hurricane that's gone on, and according to the account here, has gone on for so many days now that they haven't seen light for days. It's just been day after day after day of trying to survive in these horrendous conditions. In the midst of that, God sends an angel to Paul. And that angel tells Paul, God's already decided that you're going to stand trial before Caesar. That's what he's going to do. And he goes on from there and says, in verse 24, let's just read verse 24. It says, and the angel said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. Now this is interesting, because God not only addresses that Paul will be okay. I mean, Paul could have relaxed a little bit on the trip, knowing, okay, well, God said I'm going to be fine. But it actually says God goes a step further. And even though they've done nothing to merit it, and maritime disasters happen all the time in the ancient world, and these people could have ended their lives and been an object lesson to many other sailors, instead, God says, not just you, Paul, but out of graciousness to you, everybody else on this ship, all 276 passengers that are on board this ship. We'll hear in a moment what the crew size is. But so all of them are going to be safe, Paul says. And he's telling them to take courage, to not get desperate. But still, there's quite a journey to go through. So let's pick back up now at verses 27 through 38 and see what happens next. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. When about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land, they took soundings and found the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchor from the boat, or from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay on the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread, gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. Okay, so this hurricane force wind has now driven them clear across the ocean, and they're approaching land of some sort. Now we can cheat and look at the map and see it's Malta. It's the Isle of Malta. But they don't know this at this time. And in fact, we read that for 14 days, these sailors didn't even see daylight. There's been hurricane force winds, no doubt strong enough they could blow them off the deck. They've had several anchors in the water, and in spite of that, they're just dredging the bottom of the ocean floor. This wind is just still blowing them along and moving them. And what we hear is that at the beginning of this, they decided to change the configuration of the anchors. They adjusted around, and they put the anchors not off the bow so that they're being blown down by the wind from the front, but instead they switch it to the stern. And the idea there is, if we're going to be blown onto land, then we want the nose of our ship to be what hits the land, and we want to be able to use our navigation ability that the ship has in order to hopefully steer it around some obstacles, because they don't know if they're going to come onto a beautiful sandy beach with nothing in the way, or if they're going to come onto a cliff-filled, rocky, jagged piece of earth. They don't even know where they are. And so they're trying to prioritize all of this and figure it out. They throw everything else that they have overboard. They shift the anchors so that they can steer the ship. And as they're doing this, they're taking depth soundings. Typically, this would be done by taking a string with a weight on the end of it, throwing it over the ship, and then you'd let it drop down. And once it hit bottom, you'd pull it back up. And then you could do some math to try to figure out, based on the speed of the vessel as it was traveling at the time, what ratio do you need to subtract to it to actually find out what the depth was. And we see they go from 120 feet to 90 feet. And so the water is getting shallower and shallower, which means that land may be nearby. Even though they can't see any land, they can't see anything because there's torrential downpour of rain and terribly fast wind, and it's dark from all of that going on. In spite of that, they know there must be land coming. Now, the sailors, for their part, being the seasoned people on their figure, if we're going to go sail into some rocky, crag-filled coast, potentially, I feel a whole lot safer on a tiny little lifeboat with my buddies than I would on this giant vessel sailing into that and not knowing. And the draft that the lifeboat has would be much shallower, so if there was a sandbar or something that they could get caught in beforehand, they'd be more likely to avoid it in the lifeboat. And so these guys get sneaky, and they make it look like they're throwing an anchor overboard, but actually they take the lifeboat and they toss it over and hope that nobody figures it out. And Paul notices what's going on. Excuse me. And you see, he speaks to the Roman military officers and says, if they manage to jump off this ship, and the only people who know how to operate it run away, we're dead men. You'll all be dead. So you might want to stop that. While the sailors are more competent at sailing ships, the Roman officers are more proficient at killing people who don't do what they say. And so they win the day. They come up and they just chop the rope, and there goes the lifeboat. You can imagine, perhaps there's a sense of hopelessness that comes from that, because now there is no plan B. No one's going to be taking this lifeboat to the shore. They're just going to have to go wherever this big vessel goes and hope that the journey works out. In spite of that, Paul comes though, and he rallies the leadership, and because there's 276 people on this vessel, probably he's not actually in an auditorium speaking to all of them at once during a hurricane, but he at least speaks to a group of key leaders and conveys this message down the line that God's told them they're going to be okay. Not one person is going to die, although the ship will actually be destroyed. They should plan on that. And Paul says, You guys, for 14 days, you've been in such a panic. You've been doing damage control, just trying to keep this boat in the water. For many of them, probably been a hard time just keeping any food down in general from the violent ride they've been on. But Paul says, we need to stop now, and you all need to eat because you're going to need your strength for what comes next. Get ready. And so they have that warning, and soon enough, we'll see how this all works out, how it comes together. Good to know, too, you imagine going through these rocks, that's scary enough, but probably most of the 276 people here don't know how to swim either. In the ancient world, it was a common thing for most people not to know how to swim. In fact, in human history, there's been a lot of people. If you didn't live next to a body of water, you might very well have not learned any method of how to swim. And so this is a really daunting thing, the idea of being hurled into the sea and hoping it works out. So now we'll read verses 39 through 44. We'll finish out the passage, and then we'll circle back and discuss our application. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and to get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. Okay, so for 14 days there's been darkness. Nobody has seen the light. They know they're approaching land. They don't know where it is or what it looks like. And at the last minute, God opens up the sky. They begin to see clearly again. And although the wind, no doubt, is still forceful, they have some notion of where they're going, and they see a sandbar that they can direct themselves to. So they throw any remaining weight off of the ship that they can, because again, the deeper it drafts in the water, the more likely it is to snag something. And they'd like to land not 2 miles off the coast, but right in the beach. That would be the ideal thing. Along with this, they also go ahead and cut the anchor ropes. And in doing this, they're stopping all of the drag that was holding the ship from moving forward, and now they're going to go forcefully and go right into this land. And along with that, they even remove the rudder. Now, different ships had different configurations in the ancient world. Some of them would have actually had, but this was a small minority, some version of sort of the colonial era rudder that moves in the water back and forth. The more common thing, though, would be for a ship to have 2 paddles, one on each side at the back of the ship. And these were 2 much larger paddles, and these would be dropped in the water and drug in order to actually steer the ship one way or the other. That's probably the rudder system that they're actually referring to. But these would have trailed pretty deep in the water, because at times you might want to turn your ship quite forcefully. And so they would have a lot of weight. They'd also have a lot of depth. And if you're going in through some dicey area and then you're going to try to get to land, these could potentially snag some stuff. So they actually cut those off, break them away, and then they put on what they call the foresail. Now, there's a sail right at the front of the sailing vessel, and it can be used actually to steer the boat. And so that's the purpose of this sail. They'll open it up and move it around as they can to try to move this ship. And this is really the only steering device that's left. And as they head in, they're hoping they'll make it. This speed will carry them through. Maybe they'll brush some sand or something like that, but they'll get completely to shore is the hope. But that unfortunately isn't what happens. Instead, as they're moving forward, they forcefully jam the nose of the ship into a sandbar off the coast. And they have some distance between them and the coast. But to make matters worse, and this seems like something out of a movie or something, but the waves pounding the back of the ship, and no doubt the ship itself has been hammered so heavily that it's not held together very well anyway. The waves pounding the back of the ship, we're told, actually begin to disintegrate the back end of the sail vessel. You got a little bit of an hourglass going on now, don't you? You can wait, but you can't wait here. It's not long. The ship, you can imagine the eeriness of it as they watch this vessel just dissolving from the back, moving forward, 276 people on the deck, and the centurion steps forward and begins to give instruction. First, he sees that his men are getting ready to kill the prisoners, and that might seem crazy or impulsive. But in the Roman world, if you were a guard and you were responsible for a prisoner, and that prisoner escapes, then they would take your life for his. That's the way the system worked. So you can see as a guard, if you're thinking, I've got my gear and my sword, I already got to jump in this water. Maybe some of those guards have questionable swimming abilities, and if there's one of these guys that's a good swimmer, I could be dead because of it. So let's just stab them all, throw them overboard. We'll say they died in the shipwreck. Too bad to hear about it. And instead, we won't die for this. Fortunately, the centurion who has begun to favor Paul decides, I don't really care for that man. In fact, this guy's the only one who seems to know what's going on out here. We probably should keep him around for a while. And so they spare the prisoners, and the centurion gives some wise instruction. He tells them, anybody who can swim, it's time to jump. The timer's counting down here, so get off the boat, swim to shore. God said you're going to make it. And for the rest of you who can't swim, find something to hold on to. Something that floats, ideally, not an anchor, but a piece of wood or something, you know? And do your best here. And I'm real curious. I mean, it would be terrifying. Can you imagine? You know, you've got some decisions to make. Since the back of the ship's blowing apart and the wind is blowing everything into the island, there's probably a lot of boards down below. And on the one hand, you don't want to jump onto one of those boards. But on the other hand, if you get in the water and you can't swim, you've only got a small period of time to grab a hold of something before you go down to the bottom of the sea, right? So that's kind of scary. And you might think, well, it's only 20 feet out of the water off the deck of the ship. Maybe I'll just take the board with me. But that could go sideways too, couldn't it? You take a big board and you could not only get a lot of slivers, but still drown. And so, tenuous situation. But since this is all happening in real time and the boat is disintegrating while they're standing on it, everybody jumps overboard. And by God's grace and by God's providential hand, somehow, all 276 people make it to shore. Now, I do want to briefly mention, some people say, boy, that's a lot of people to have on a boat. Is that really realistic? And it's good to note, the historian Josephus, who was alive, contemporary to Jesus' day, gives account of a shipwreck that he was involved in which 600 people were on a ship that he was on. And when the ship wrecked, in a very similar fashion to this, of the 600, 80 managed to survive. And that would have been pretty common in the ancient world. You know, there's lots of things to kill you in the water, lots of ways to drown, lots of rocks you can hit your head on, all kinds of things that can really go terribly wrong. So it's a true miracle that this many people made it to shore. And again, we see it's totally by God's hand. So what do we do with this? How do we apply this to our lives? Well, maybe fly instead of being on a boat. Yeah, that's not really it, though, is it? What I want to emphasize is back to the words that the angel gave the Apostle Paul to begin with. If Paul hadn't been on this ship, the angel said, God has decided that he's going to save you because you're going to go see Caesar in Rome. And that not only that, but God out of his grace, he's going to save everybody else on the ship. All 275 other people besides Paul are going to live as well. And the only causation to this is, Paul, because you're here. If Paul hadn't been on that boat, is there a good chance this would have been a warning to other sailors instead of a story of miraculous survival? Sure sounds like it, right, from that account. Or if Paul had been on that boat, but he'd been ignoring God and not doing what God had been leading him to do, the outcome could have been quite different too. The only reason that everybody's spared in this instance is because Paul's living his life in such a way that he's focused on what God wants. That he's seeking after God's kingdom and seeking to do what God wants him to do. And that's involved being in prison, and that's involved being beaten and nearly executed and all kinds of things going wrong in his life. But in spite of all the hardship that Paul has suffered and all the ways that life seems to have gone wrong from the world's perspective, Paul continues on. God says to visit Caesar in Rome. Well, that's where Paul's going. And it's fascinating to read here that had Paul made a different decision, the outcome might have been different for him, but it might have been different for other people around him. And I think there's a deeper truth behind this. That if you decide to live your life focused on God and his kingdom, then although things can seriously go wrong, and they did in this case, God's blessing is more likely to follow it. If you're out reaching people for Jesus Christ or growing his kingdom, there's a good chance God might want to keep you around to keep doing it. And in this case, we see that happen to Paul. My question for everybody here today is, are you living life well enough that the ship might have been saved? Whose kingdom are you focused on? And let me say, this is a hard one for me too. Right? There's a lot of things in our life that can distract us from living for God. The pursuit of wealth, just trying to maintain the amount of junk that we keep in our lives. It's something my wife and I have been convicted of lately. We just need to get rid of some stuff. This stuff is owning us, we're not owning it. Could be a relationship that you've decided to seek after, even though you know darn well God said not to. Or you didn't even bother to ask him to begin with. Might be a career that you've given your life over to, a singular focus. And that's the most important thing in your life. And you'll do the God stuff if there's time for it. Could be something as innocuous as your kids or grandkids' sporting events that you're going to. I'm not saying that all these things are bad. But if we choose them over God, and if we choose to make them the singular focus of our life, then we're really not living for God. I mean, we might show up to church occasionally, we might sing the songs, but that's not good enough. God expects our full surrender. He expects us to live lives that way. And if we're not, then we could be missing out on a lot of the blessing that God has for us. Certainly in this case, there were 275 very blessed people to have the one guy who was bothering to listen to God present. We could argue about Timothy and the others, but the big point here is things were different because of that, and they can be in our life too. So my challenge to you this week is look for areas in your life that are pulling you away from seeking God's kingdom first. Look for idols that you have, that you've been choosing before God. You might look at your checkbook. That can be a good barometer. See where all your money's going. Jesus said where your treasure is, there your heart is also. I'm not saying don't buy food, that you can't drive a car. I'm not going to this extreme measure. I'm not talking about asceticism. But seriously, weigh out where your resources are flowing, because it may speak to where your heart is. Or, here's another one, look at your calendar. Where's all your time going? Are you doing things for God's kingdom in the midst of that? Or is it all about the stuff you want? The strange part is, a lot of the stuff you want, you can actually do for God's sake. You can put him in the middle of it. But it won't happen unless you're intentional about it. And there is real dangers to us when we're not. I hope that each of us can work this week to live lives more on fire for Jesus than they were the week before. If we do that, we're more likely to have God's blessing when we face these adversities. To have him behind us, because he knows we're working towards it for him, for his kingdom, and we're working to get things done. I'm not saying that you could never experience a shipwreck or things don't go wrong. Everything's gone wrong for Paul in the course of things, but God's always sustained him through it, and he's always been there, and in often miraculous ways. And I don't think God would have been there in that manner had Paul not given his heart fully to God and been seeking him first. The same is true for us. All right, at this point I'm going to ask one of our leaders to come forward and lead us in our meditations. As Nate does, I'll ask our deacons as well. We're going to serve our communion offering too, and as they do that, please join me for a moment of prayer. Heavenly Father, we live lives filled with lesser things. And way too often, those little things become bigger than they should. Father, please give us a perspective grounded in eternity, not in today. And help us to have wisdom and a ruthless discernment to know things in our life that we need to cut back from, or that we need to refocus on, or that we need to let loose of, or that we need to bring in, whatever it is, Lord. I know each of us are at different points, and yet this truth is universal, that unless our hearts are yours and given to you fully, your full blessing won't follow. Lord, we lift this up to you. We pray for the discernment as we look at ourselves. We ask these things in Jesus Christ's name and pray, Father.